pinned against her own granite countertop while her neighbors laughed at a barbecue just feet away. Meredith felt the cold bite of a kitchen knife handle pressed into her palm. Her husband David leaned in, his voice a terrifyingly calm whisper as he explained that their children were already being escorted to an airport for a forced relocation. "If I fall, you go to prison for the laundering," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "The accounts are drained, and the feds are at the gate. You aren't my wife anymore, Meredith. You're my collateral." The silence of their 5-acre estate had become a tomb. Just an hour ago, she was a top-tier real estate mogul. Now, she was an unwitting accomplice to decade-long espionage, trapped in a gilded cage with a man whose real name she didn't even know. As the blue and red lights of a silent alarm began to pulse against the kitchen tiles, Meredith realized the man she had slept next to for 15 years wasn't a husband, but a ghost who had finally decided to haunt her. The only question left was whether she would let him take her down with the ship, or if she could burn the house of cards before the first handcuff clicked shut. The screen's glow pooled on the desk like spilled milk, too bright in the dim room. Meredith's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the plastic keys cool and slightly sticky under her fingertips. The notification pulsed in the corner, urgent. But she clicked it anyway, the way you prod a loose tooth with your tongue, knowing it'll hurt but unable to stop. The words blurred for a second. Social Security mismatch. Infant. Deceased. 1978. Her breath hitched, sharp as a paper cut. The air in the office thickened, pressing against her ribs. She read it again, then a third time, as if repetition could rewrite the truth. The database, a cold and unfeeling architect of her destruction, stared back with unblinking eyes. David Callahan, the man she had shared a bed with for 15 years, did not exist. Or rather, the identity he wore like a tailored suit belonged to a child who had never seen his first birthday, buried in a forgotten plot in Illinois decades ago. The foundation of her life, built on the solid ground of Naperville respectability, suddenly felt like a sinkhole opening beneath her designer heels. Upstairs, the floorboards groaned under David's weight. She hadn't heard him come in, but there he was, his slow, even breathing seeping through the cracked door. Meredith stood, her knees locking for a second before she forced them to move. The hallway stretched too long, the wallpaper's faded roses blurring at the edges of her vision. She gripped the doorframe, the wood rough under her palm, splintering slightly where the paint had chipped. David lay on his side, one arm flung above his head like a child. The sheet had slipped, exposing the scar on his shoulder, the one he'd gotten climbing trees as a kid, or so he'd said. His chest rose and fell, steady, unconcerned. The lamp on the nightstand cast shadows under his eyelids, turning them bruise purple. Meredith's throat burned. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shake him awake and demand answers. Instead, she exhaled through her nose, the sound too loud in the quiet room. The scent of his aftershave, something citrusy, cheap, lingered in the air, mixing with the stale coffee on her breath. Looking at him, she felt a profound sense of vertigo. He was a fabrication, a ghost inhabiting a stolen life, and the man she loved was merely a performance she had paid for with her trust. The morning light offered no sanctuary, only a clearer view of the wreckage. Meredith retreated to her workstation, the familiar interface of her real estate title-searching software providing a sense of clinical purpose. She was a top-tier agent. She knew how to find the rot beneath a fresh coat of paint. She bypassed standard privacy blocks with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 2 decades hunting down liens and undisclosed easements. Systematically, she began to pull at the threads of David's history. She searched for his university transcripts, his early employment records, his birth certificate, the paper trail that should have trailed behind a 51-year-old man like a wake. There was nothing. Every search returned a suspicious void, a digital black hole where a person should be. She cross-referenced his professional licenses against state databases, her eyes stinging from the blue light. The deeper she dug, the more the silence screamed. It wasn't just that he was missing. It was that he had been created, fully formed, only 15 years ago, precisely when he had walked into her life at a gallery opening in Chicago. Her focus shifted to the digital copies of David's architectural licenses stored in their shared cloud drive. She zoomed in on the official seals, her pulse hammering in her wrists. To a casual observer, the documents were impeccable, but Meredith's eyes were trained to spot the microscopic flaws in a deed. She noticed a subtle inconsistency in the registration numbers, a font that was a fraction of a millimeter too narrow, a seal that lacked the raised texture characteristic of state-issued certificates. These were high-quality forgeries, sophisticated enough to deceive a board of directors. But they could not withstand the scrutiny of a woman who felt her world dissolving. He had no legal right to practice architecture. He had no right to lead the firm that funded their 5-acre estate. Every contract he had signed, every building he had designed, was a legal time bomb. The realization was a cold weight in her stomach. She wasn't just married to a liar. She was living in a house built on criminal fraud. The need for a professional perspective became a physical ache. She reached out to Miller, a man whose name she had kept in a locked drawer of her mind since her father's embezzlement scandal. Miller was a cynical private investigator who looked like he had been carved out of old leather and disappointment. They met at a secluded park on the outskirts of the county, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and approaching rain. Meredith handed him a folder of her initial findings, her hands trembling as she smoothed the paper. "I need to know who he is, Miller," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Not the man in my bed. The man who stole that Social Security number." Miller took the folder without a word, his yellowed fingers tracing the edges of the forged licenses. He didn't offer comfort. He offered a grim nod that suggested he had seen this kind of rot before. He promised to bypass the legal boundaries she couldn't touch, to dig into the shadows where David Callahan, or whoever he was, kept his true history. 3 days later, the phone rang at 2 a.m. Miller's voice was a gravelly rasp over the line, devoid of preamble. "Found something. A burner phone was recovered at a hit-and-run scene in the city last month. Grisly stuff. The victim is still in a coma." Meredith's grip tightened on the receiver until her knuckles turned white. "What does that have to do with David?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "The phone is registered to an alias," Miller replied. "Elias Thorne. But the GPS pings on that device overlap perfectly with your husband's business trips to Chicago. He's not just an identity thief, Meredith. He's active. He's doing work under that name, and that work involves leaving bodies in the street." The room seemed to tilt. Elias Thorne. The name felt like a shard of glass in her mind. David wasn't just running from a past. He was building a violent present, using their suburban life as a camouflage for something far darker than she had ever imagined. She sat in her dark home office for hours after the call, the silence of the house pressing against her ears. Around her lay the printed evidence of his deception, the forged licenses, the death certificate of the real David Callahan, the notes from Miller. The Naperville mansion, once her pride and joy, now felt like a gilded cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the central heating, sounded like a threat. She felt isolated, a woman standing on a crumbling cliffside while the man who had pushed her slept soundly just feet away. The vulnerability was a physical sensation, a cold draft on the back of her neck. She realized she couldn't stay. She had to formulate a plan, a way to extract herself and the children before the shadow of Elias Thorne swallowed them whole. But how do you run from a man who knows your every move, who has built a fortress around your life? The silence was shattered by the sudden, piercing shriek of the home security alarm. The sound was a physical blow, vibrating in Meredith's teeth. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Then came the sound of breaking glass, a sharp, crystalline explosion from the direction of the sliding doors in the den. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She didn't think, she reacted. She scrambled toward the desk, her eyes darting to the monitor where the security feed should have been, but the screen was black. Someone had cut the wires. A shadow moved in the doorway, a tall, lean figure clad in black, a featureless mask obscuring his face. He didn't hesitate. He lunged for the desk, his gloved hands reaching for the laptop that held every secret she had uncovered. He wasn't there for her. He was there for the evidence. The realization gave her a sudden, fierce clarity. This wasn't a random burglary. This was a retrieval. The intruder's weight bore down on her, the smell of damp wool and sweat filling her senses. They grappled across the desk, the laptop sliding toward the edge. Meredith felt a surge of desperate intensity, a primal need to protect the truth. She clawed at his arms, her nails catching on the tough fabric of his jacket. But he was stronger, his movements practiced and efficient. He shoved her back, her hip catching the corner of the mahogany desk with a sickening thud. He reached for the computer again, his fingers closing around the lid. In that moment, Meredith realized that if he took the laptop, she was truly lost. She would have no proof, no leverage, and no way to protect her children from the ghost in their home. The domestic mystery had vanished, replaced by the raw, terrifying reality of a physical struggle for survival. Her fingers brushed against something heavy on the corner of the desk. The Crystal Agent of the Year award she had won last spring. It was a jagged, heavy spire of glass, cold and lethal. She gripped the base and swung with everything she had. The crystal caught the assailant across the temple with a dull, wet thrum. He grunted, his grip on the laptop loosening as his head snapped to the side. Blood, dark and thick in the dim light, sprayed across the white keys of the keyboard. He staggered back, clutching his face, his breath coming in ragged, dazed gasps. Meredith didn't wait for him to recover. She lunged forward, shoving him toward the broken window. He was disoriented, his movements leaden. He tumbled through the jagged frame, his boots crunching on the glass outside before he disappeared into the darkness of the yard. Meredith stood shaking, the crystal award still clutched in her hand, her chest heaving as the distant wail of a siren began to rise from the edges of the neighborhood. As the adrenaline began to ebb, her eyes fell on a small, silver object, glinting on the floorboards where the struggle had taken place. It was a flash drive, knocked loose from the intruder's pocket, or perhaps dropped in his haste to flee. Her hands shook so violently she had to use both to plug it into the laptop. The drive was encrypted, but the folder names were visible. Offshore Alpha, Extraction Log, Thorn Ledger. She clicked through the files, her breath hitching as she saw spreadsheets detailing millions of dollars in transfers to banks in the Cayman Islands and Panama. This wasn't just architecture. This was a complex, international money laundering operation. David's firm wasn't a business. It was a conduit for the proceeds of something global and illicit. The architectural projects were merely ghosts, shells designed to move money across borders without raising the suspicions of the feds. Just before the police lights began to strove against the office walls, Meredith noticed a dark garment snagged on a shard of glass in the window frame. It was a windbreaker, discarded or torn from the intruder during his escape. She pulled it inside, her heart stopping as she saw the logo embroidered over the breast. It was the stylized C of Callahan Architectural Associates. The intruder hadn't been a stranger. He had been one of David's employees. The realization was a physical blow to her stomach. The men David hired, the architects who sat in the sleek Chicago office, were not designers. They were a professional cleanup crew, a private security force tasked with protecting the secrets of Elias Thorne. She wasn't just living with a criminal. She was surrounded by a small army of them, all drawing a paycheck from the lies she had helped build. The next morning, David returned from his site visit with a look of practiced concern that made Meredith's skin crawl. He didn't mention the break-in until he had poured her a cup of coffee, his movements smooth and deliberate. "I heard about the excitement last night," he said, his voice a soothing baritone. "I've already called the security company. We're upgrading everything. And I've installed a new safety app on your phone, Mir. It's linked to my system. If anything happens, I'll know exactly where you are." He took her phone from the counter and tapped the screen, his thumb lingering over the glass. Meredith watched him, her throat tight. He was smiling, but his eyes were cold, unblinking. He wasn't protecting her. He was tightening the digital leash. Under the guise of a family safety update, he had turned her own phone into a tracking device, a constant eye that would report her every movement back to him. The atmosphere in the house shifted from tense to suffocating. David didn't go to the office. He stayed home, his presence a constant, heavy weight in every room. He followed her from the kitchen to the laundry room, offering to help with the smallest tasks, his eyes never leaving her for long. When she tried to go into her office, he was already there, organizing her files. When she picked up her phone, he was suddenly behind her, asking who she was texting. The psychological pressure was a physical force, a tightening knot in her chest. He was monitoring her suspicions, waiting for her to make a mistake, to reveal how much she truly knew. She felt the walls of the mansion closing in, the open-plan design she had once loved now offering no place to hide. Every conversation was a minefield, every silence a countdown. She found the confirmation of that countdown later that evening. David had left his tablet on the bedside table while he showered, the screen still glowing. Meredith swiped the glass, her heart hammering. Deep in the system settings, hidden behind a series of dummy folders, she found a countdown timer. 46:12:08. Below it, a single line of text. Elias Thorne. Final deletion. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He was ending the identity. In less than 48 hours, Elias Thorne would cease to exist, and David Callahan would likely follow. He was planning to vanish, to abandon the life they had built and start over somewhere else, leaving her and the children in the wreckage of his crimes. The desperation she felt was no longer just for the truth. It was for time. She had 2 days to secure enough evidence to stop him, or he would disappear into the shadows forever, taking her children with him. She knew she had to get the kids out. She told David she was taking them to her sister's for an impromptu sleepover, her voice remarkably steady despite the roar of blood in her ears. She loaded them into the SUV, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles ached. But when she pressed the remote for the massive electronic estate gates, nothing happened. The heavy iron bars remained stubbornly shut. She tried again, then a third time, the motor whining but the gates refusing to budge. "David," she shouted, stepping out of the car. He was standing on the front porch, his arms crossed over his chest, a dark silhouette against the cream-colored stucco. Something's wrong with the gates. He didn't move. "I know, honey," he called back, his voice devoid of warmth. "I've locked them down. There's been a glitch in the security update. It's for your own safety. We can't have anyone getting in or out until the technicians arrive on Monday." He walked down the driveway toward the car, his steps measured and rhythmic. He leaned against the driver's side door, looking in at the children with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry, kids. The sleepover's canceled. Why don't you go back inside and put on a movie?" Meredith felt a surge of cold fury. "Give me the manual override code, David," she said, her voice a low hiss. He straightened up, his face hardening into a mask of cold calculation. "I don't think so, Meredith. You're stressed. You're not thinking clearly. We're all going to stay right here where I can keep an eye on you." The pretense was gone. He wasn't a husband anymore. He was a jailer. The security system she had helped design, the gates she had thought protected her family from the world, had been turned into the walls of a prison. Desperate, she waited until the house was silent, the only sound the rhythmic hum of the smart home hub. She sent a coded emergency signal to Miller, a series of blank texts they had agreed upon, and arranged a midnight meeting at a small construction site a mile away. She couldn't use the doors. The sensors would alert David's phone instantly. Instead, she moved through the basement, her breath shallow and jagged. She found the small, high window in the crawl space, the one hidden behind a stack of old holiday decorations. She squeezed through the frame, the rough concrete scraping her shoulders, and dropped into the damp grass of the side yard. She avoided the pools of light from the security cameras, moving like a shadow through the trees. Her car was parked just outside the perimeter fence, a silent getaway vehicle waiting in the dark. She reached it, her heart racing, and fumbled for the keys. She was halfway down the driveway when a pair of blinding headlights cut through the darkness behind her. A black SUV, its engine a low, predatory growl, roared out from behind the guest house. It wasn't David. It was the consultant she had seen in the office, the man who had led the cleanup crew. He swung the SUV across the driveway, blocking her path with a screech of tires. Meredith slammed on the brakes, her chest heaving. The consultant didn't get out. He just sat there, the tinted windshield reflecting the moon. She realized then that David's architectural firm wasn't just a front. It was a coordinated criminal organization, and she was being hunted by professional operatives. They weren't going to let her meet Miller. They were going to take the drive, and then they were going to take her. Meredith didn't hesitate. She slammed the car into reverse, the tires spitting gravel as she backed up wildly toward the side lawn. She found a gap in the hedges and floored it, the SUV bouncing over the curb and onto the narrow back street that bordered the estate. The consultant was right behind her, his headlights filling her rearview mirror. The high-speed chase through the winding back streets of Naperville was a blur of neon and shadow. She knew these roads better than anyone. She had sold half the houses on this block. She pushed the car to its limit, the engine screaming as she navigated narrow alleys and sharp turns that would have been impossible for a larger vehicle. The consultant was aggressive, ramming her back bumper, his intent clear. He was willing to cause a fatal accident to recover the flash drive. As they neared a sprawling construction site at the edge of the neighborhood, Meredith saw her chance. A deep drainage ditch had been dug along the side of the road, hidden by a thin layer of orange safety netting and a pile of loose gravel. She waited until the last possible second, feinting a turn into the site, then jerked the wheel back toward the asphalt. The consultant, blinded by his own speed and the dust she had kicked up, couldn't react in time. His SUV hit the gravel, skidded wildly, and plunged nose first into the ditch with a sickening crunch of metal and glass. Meredith didn't stop to look. She sped away, her hands shaking so hard she could barely steer, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had escaped the immediate threat, but she knew the clock was still ticking. She pulled over a few miles away, tucked into the shadow of a closed gas station, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She needed to charge her phone. The battery was dying from the constant GPS pings. She reached into the glove box, fumbling past the owner's manual and a stack of old napkins. Her fingers brushed against a thick manila envelope she didn't recognize. She pulled it out, her blood turning to ice as she saw her own name written on the front in David's precise, architectural script. Inside was a stack of pre-signed real estate contracts, commercial deals for high-rise developments and shopping centers she had never even heard of. She flipped through the pages, her eyes widening as she saw her own signatures on every line. They were perfect forgeries, indistinguishable from her own hand. The realization was a physical blow that left her gasping for air. David hadn't just been lying about his identity. He had been using her professional reputation as a shield. He had been funneling the proceeds of his espionage and money laundering through her real estate commissions for years, hiding the illicit cash in the legitimate transactions of her business. By forging her name on these contracts, he had made her the legal primary on millions of dollars in criminal activity. She wasn't just his wife. She was his unwitting accomplice. If the feds moved in, the paper trail wouldn't lead to Elias Thorne. It would lead directly to Meredith Callahan. She couldn't go to the police. She couldn't call the authorities. To do so would be to sign her own arrest warrant and guarantee that she would spend the next 20 years in a federal prison. The day of the annual neighborhood barbecue arrived with a cruel, sun-drenched irony. Meredith stood on the patio, a glass of chilled Chardonnay in her hand. A practiced smile pinned to her face as she greeted the retired couple from down the street. David stood at the grill, the quintessential suburban host, flipping burgers and sharing a laugh with the local councilman. He was attentive, his hand frequently finding the small of her back, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like a brand. Meredith felt like she was moving through a dream, the laughter of her neighbors sounding like static in her ears. She was trapped in the middle of a public performance, playing the role of the happy wife while her world burned down around her. The estate was swarming with people, yet she had never felt more alone. Miller arrived an hour into the party, dressed in a rumpled linen suit that made him look like a disgruntled academic. He approached her by the drink station, his eyes darting toward David. "We need to talk," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft jazz playing from the outdoor speakers. "The feds are closing in, Meredith. They've traced the offshore accounts from the hit-and-run phone. They're planning a raid on the firm and this property within the next 12 hours. You need to get out now." Meredith felt a surge of hope, followed immediately by a crushing weight. "I can't," she breathed. "He's forged my name on everything. If they raid this place, I'm the one they'll take." Miller's face didn't change, but his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "Then find the leverage, Meredith. Find the one thing he hasn't digitized." She slipped away from the party under the pretense of getting more ice, her heart hammering as she descended into the basement. She bypassed the kitchen and headed for the crawl space, the low, damp void beneath the house where secrets were meant to rot. She crawled over the dirt floor, her silk dress staining, until she reached the far corner. Hidden behind a loose foundation stone was a black duffel bag, David's go bag. She unzipped it, her breath catching as she saw the contents. A stack of high-quality fake passports for the entire family, $10,000 in cash, and a master key to an encrypted hard drive. This was his contingency plan. He wasn't just planning to disappear, he was planning to take them with him, to force them into a life of permanent fugitives under names they didn't know. She was halfway out of the crawl space when a shadow fell across the dirt. David was standing in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the basement. He didn't say a word. He just reached down and grabbed her by the arm, his grip crushing and inescapable. He hauled her into the kitchen, slamming the door shut and locking it with a sharp click. The transition from the festive, sunlit yard to the cold, clinical kitchen was jarring. Meredith stumbled against the granite island, the go-bag clutched to her chest. David didn't yell. He didn't lose his temper. He simply stood there, his face a mask of predatory calm, his eyes as dark and unyielding as the stone countertops. The man she had married was gone, replaced by the monster he had been hiding for 15 years. He pinned her against the counter, his hands gripping her wrists until she felt the bone groan. "You should have stayed in the yard, Meredith," he said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. "You should have kept smiling." He leaned in close, the scent of sandalwood and charcoal smoke filling her senses. "Do you think I didn't plan for this? Every contract you signed, every dollar that moved through your accounts, it's all documented. If the feds walk through that door, you're the mastermind. I'm just the husband who didn't ask enough questions." He squeezed her wrists harder, forcing her to look him in the eye. "You defy me again, and I'll make sure you never see those children outside of a plexiglass window." He let go of her wrists and stepped back, pacing the length of the kitchen with a restless, coiled energy. "I've already moved the money," he said, his voice conversational now, as if they were discussing the mortgage. "The life savings, the college funds, the equity in this house, it's all gone. It's in an offshore account that requires a biometric key you don't have. You have nothing, Meredith. No money, no legal standing, and no way out." He stopped and looked at her, a faint, cruel smile touching his lips. "You're completely dependent on me now. You're going to go back out there, you're going to finish this party, and tomorrow morning we're going to leave. And you're going to do it with a smile on your face." The final blow came with a hiss of breath against her ear. "And don't even think about the kids. They're the only reason you're not in that ditch with the consultant. You go to the police, and I'll make sure the state takes them. Foster care is a lonely place for children who are used to mansions, don't you think?" He was using her maternal instincts as a weapon, turning her love for her children into the very chains that bound her to him. Meredith felt a wave of profound vertigo. She was surrounded by friends and neighbors, trapped in her own home, and she was utterly, hopelessly alone. The phone in her pocket buzzed. A call from Miller. She glanced at David, who nodded mockingly. She answered, her voice a trembling thread. "Miller?" There was a long silence on the other end, the sound of heavy breathing. "Meredith?" Miller said, his voice shaking in a way she had never heard. "I'm sorry. He came to me weeks ago. He's been paying me since the first day you walked into my office. Everything you told me, every lead I gave you, it was all a script he wrote." Meredith felt the floor drop out from under her. The betrayal was total. Her only ally, her only hope for an escape, had been an informant for the man she was trying to flee. Every secret she had shared had been relayed back to David within the hour. "He's a professional, Meredith," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "I couldn't say no. Not to a man like him." The line went dead. Meredith stared at the phone, the screen reflecting her own pale, terrified face. She realized then the true scope of David's architecture. He hadn't just built a fake life. He had built a controlled environment where every variable was accounted for, every escape route blocked before she even knew it existed. She was a mouse in a maze he had designed, and he was simply watching her run until she hit the wall he had placed at the end. She looked out the kitchen window at the neighbors. They were laughing, clinking glasses, completely unaware that they were standing in the middle of a crime scene. The contrast between the suburban normalcy of the barbecue and the dire, violent reality of her life created a sense of crushing isolation. She was a ghost in her own home, a woman who had already been erased by the man she loved. She realized she had an impossible choice: stay and become a permanent fugitive in a life of lies, or fight and risk losing everything. Her freedom, her children, her very identity. David leaned in, his voice a cold draft against her neck. South America, Meredith. The flight leaves at 6 a.m. The children are already being escorted to the airport by my associates. They're safe for now. But their safety depends entirely on your cooperation for the next 12 hours. He patted her cheek, a gesture so patronizing and cruel it made her stomach turn. Now, go back out there. Our guests are waiting. Meredith stood paralyzed, her mind a frantic whirl of fear and calculation. She had reached her lowest point, her love revealed as a decade-long performance, her life a hollow shell. But as she looked at the smart home hub on the wall, a flicker of her professional expertise, the part of her that knew how to stage a scene, began to spark. She didn't go back to the party immediately. She moved to the living room, her fingers flying over the integrated smart system hub. She pretended to adjust the outdoor playlist, her eyes darting toward the window where David was watching her from the lawn. She accessed the administrative back-end of the property's central server using the override codes she had memorized during the installation. She wasn't a hacker, but she knew this system better than anyone. She had sold it as the ultimate luxury feature to a dozen clients. She navigated to the hidden recording folder, her heart stopping as she found the file from the kitchen confrontation. She had planted a small, high-gain microphone in the smoke detector weeks ago. A desperate gamble that was finally paying off. She synced the home's high-end outdoor theater system with the audio file. She carefully routed the output to every external speaker, every digital screen, and every smart device in the backyard. She could see David through the glass, his brow furrowing as he noticed her lingering at the hub. He started toward the house, his pace quickening. Meredith didn't blink. She hit the broadcast button and then triggered the silent panic alarm linked to her real estate firm, a high-priority signal that bypassed the home's standard security and went directly to the county dispatcher. Suddenly, David's voice boomed across the entire backyard, amplified by the 12,000-watt theater system. If the feds walk through that door, you're the mastermind. I've already moved the money. Foster care is a lonely place for children who are used to mansions. The recording was crystal clear, stripping away the mask of suburban perfection in front of dozens of influential witnesses. The neighbors froze, burgers halfway to their mouths, wine glasses suspended in midair. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the cold, mechanical confession of the man they had all called a friend. David stopped in the middle of the lawn, his face pale, his eyes wide with a shock that quickly curdled into a murderous rage. The neighborhood guests didn't move for a long heartbeat. Then the confusion shifted. The councilman stepped back, his face darkening with hostility. The retired officer from down the street stood up, his posture shifting into something authoritative. Meredith watched from the window as the crowd formed a human barrier between David and the driveway. He tried to push through, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to explain it away as a joke, a prank. But the recording continued to play, detailing the espionage, the hit and run, the framing of his wife. The mask had been ripped off, and there was no putting it back on. The distant wail of sirens grew rapidly, a chorus of authority descending on the estate. Within minutes, The driveway was a sea of blue and red lights. Police cruisers and federal vehicles swarmed the property, tactical teams in black gear spilling out and securing the perimeter. The neighborhood barbecue had become a massive law enforcement operation. Meredith stepped out onto the porch, her legs shaking but her head held high. She watched as a federal agent, a woman with iron gray hair and a badge that gleamed in the setting sun, approached David. "Elias Thorne?" she asked, her voice flat and final. David didn't answer. He didn't have to. The agent turned to Meredith, her expression unreadable. "He's not an architect, Mrs. Callahan. He was the lead witness in a decade-old federal case against a weapons cartel. He flipped, took the immunity, and then vanished with the evidence he was supposed to turn over. We've been looking for him for a long time." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. David Callahan wasn't just a criminal. He was a traitor to everyone he had ever known. A man who had built a life on the bodies of the people he had betrayed. The David she knew was a deep cover fabrication. A ghost who had finally been caught in the light. The struggle was brief and violent. David tried to bolt, but he was tackled onto the very barbecue grill he had been manning just minutes before. The sound of the struggle, the clatter of metal, and the sharp commands of the officers filled the air. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as the pillar of their community was pinned to the ground and handcuffed. The physical collapse of his meticulously constructed facade was total. Meredith felt a strange, hollow sense of relief. The monster was in chains, and the lies were finally over. Weeks later, Meredith sat in a modest, quiet apartment on the other side of town. The mansion was gone, seized by the government along with the accounts and the cars. She was broke, her professional reputation tarnished by the association. But as she watched her children sleep safely in the small bedroom, she felt a profound sense of peace. The silence in the apartment wasn't the heavy, watchful silence of the mansion. It was honest. She had traded her gilded prison for a future that was uncertain, difficult, and real. She was no longer sleeping next to a shadow. She was Meredith Callahan, and for the first time in 15 years, she knew exactly who she was.